The global fight against the pandemic has made little progress with the scarce delivery of COVID vaccines to vulnerable nations as rich countries have stockpiled doses. Earlier, the World Health Organization granted emergency approval for China's Sinopharm vaccine, the first from a non-Western country to gain the WHO's approval. China has also announced it will provide 10 million vaccine doses to COVAX for emergency use in developing countries, becoming the biggest economy to back the COVAX initiative to date. So, could Chinese vaccines help turn the tide against the pandemic? Could geopolitics get in the way of matters of life and death? Earlier, I spoke to Zha Daojiong, a professor at the School of International Studies with Peking University. He's been doing research about vaccines and politics behind vaccines for some time. Let's hear his insights. I'm joined by Professor Zha Daojiong from the School of International Studies at Peking University. He's been devoting a lot of his energy recently on vaccine-related issues research. Professor Zha, good to see you again.
Good seeing you, and good evening.
Good evening to you. Now, what do you make of finally some of China's vaccines made onto the emergency use list of WHO's vaccine for COVID-19?
It's a development that's worth celebrating for possibly three main reasons. One is that the WHO has really exercised its authority in approving a quality vaccine, as you have certainly observed along the way. There were numerous questioning about the safety, efficacy of the Chinese-made vaccines, and there were accusations of China using vaccines for diplomatic purpose. So the WHO was under a lot of stress, but it exercised its proper judgment. And secondly, for the Chinese product itself, it can take pride in the fact that this is the first vaccine that's developed in a developing country that has received emergency use authorization by the WHO. And it's a milestone achievement. Now, most importantly, that's a third one, that is the Chinese vaccine, because partly because of what's accused of political diplomacy. China has been working rather hard in making its vaccine products available both domestically and internationally. If you look at the number of doses injected, about half were in China, about half abroad. Yes. So the rest of the world, especially in the poor countries, desperately needs vaccines, so we have this available and with good authorization.
Now, this is quite unprecedented, but at the same time, before this, China's vaccines have already won, bilateral approval in 40 countries and regions already. What does that mean to WHO in a way as reference?
Well, the WHO actually is more than just a bureaucracy. It formulates it appoints a panel that's called, the acronym is SAGE, which is Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in Immunology. So in other words, these are individuals who normally work in hospitals, in university research labs, in teaching jobs. These are really professionals around the world who have their personal career and reputation on the line. So they're making their independent judgments. They make a recommendation for the WHO headquarters to adopt.
Yes.
So we're really talking about expertise. But in terms of, I don't think the SAGE group counts, the number of government that approve any vaccine, or it worries about vaccine approvals at all. Basically, these are professionals, right. The research people who have to be responsible to science.
Professor Zha, the other thing is about the types of vaccines that China produces different if you look at the short list of emergency use by WHO, very different in types compared to the other vaccines. So how do you see the fact that it seems that all kinds of vaccines now are making themselves onto the list?
There are at least 14 proven pathways to develop a vaccine from scratch. Now, the methodology that's being used by the 2 Chinese vaccines in the UL list is proven. It has been in the market for some 30 to 40 years. It's not the vaccine that use what's called more advanced or latest development in some of the Western countries. But I don't really know if how to assess this. Whatever technology, whatever technological pathway you take, at the end of the day, it has to be proven safe and effective. Right. And to assess the effectiveness or possible side effects, we are really talking about years after years of tracking after the injection. So the conclusion about which methodology really works is too early.
Let me ask you, the world is not in a vacuum. There are so many different factors that are impacting on the future of vaccines, including on the COVAX platform. Now, how much geopolitics is play its role? At this moment, how much can we afford geopolitics to play its role? In terms of life and death, how are we going to make our choice, politics or life?
At this point of time, highly political, partly because of the uncertainties of new variants, and then the challenge between opening your borders and closing the borders, or choosing that narrow window. Everybody wants to return to normal as fast as possible. What's not being justifiable is that some of the developed countries are literally hoarding vaccines. And the vaccines have a lifespan. Some of the new products actually will have to be discarded or destroyed after a couple of months of storage. And then you have residents in many of the developed countries that refuse to take the vaccines. So an obvious solution in terms of humanity is to ship these availables through COVAX or bilaterally, but that's not being done. Or in the case of some situations, some governments say, well, I can ship to you certain million doses, but this is really a loan to you. At some point of time, you have to return it to me.
Yeah.
And this is a very typical my country first approach. But you asked a really good question. But on the other hand, I would think the dire situation is that the developing countries have to just find ways to get into partnerships and speed up probably manufacturing of vaccines outside certain prime locations. But of course, that needs to be done on the basis of safety first and the technical expertise first.
Now, of course, India used to play a big role in terms of international production of vaccines. Now, the country itself faces certain challenge and therefore decided not to export vaccines anymore that they produced. So, Professor Zha, how big a vacuum or a hole we are likely to see? Do you see others will be able to play a proactive role in terms of filling that holes?
It's a big yes and no. Now, a word about the Indian situation first. India is very strong in manufacturing the vaccines, as just pointed out. But it has to be living at the mercy of, opening the supply chain, keeping the supply chains open in terms of the raw materials, in terms of the ingredients, and especially the key ingredients that developed in labs in Europe and North America. Otherwise, the factories in India are going to be running on empty. And secondly, India has its own version of vaccines, and that production can be ramped up, and then to address the dire situation in that country, I would think to have some confidence in the vaccines that produced later on in India, or is that we really help India with the ingredients so that they can move forward and get the factories running in full capacity again and vaccinate Indian. But then for other countries, you paid attention, here in China, over there in South Korea, in Mexico and Vietnam, Brazil and whatnot, Malaysia and Singapore. We have a lot of facilities that can manufacture as well. Here the issue is intellectual property rights, the issue is technology transfer, and then you also have the issue of, this goes back to those companies that have been recommended by the WHO to supply the world. They should really rethink the good old strategy of maximizing the profits. If they can come down with that demand for maximizing shareholder profits, they can reduce the premium they charge on the manufacturers, they can simplify the procedures, then we can expand production fairly fast.
Yeah. Professor Zha Daojiong from Peking University, who has been devoting his energy recently on the research of geopolitics related to vaccines. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.